Fáilte go, good news for Armagh. This is the podcast that looks at the big questions of the universe and of our hearts. And we are just delighted to have on Crawford Gribben. And if you don't know Crawford, Crawford is a historian and a lecturer at the moment in Queen's. And he's written a really great book, and I really do recommend it. I'm not fully through it. That's my confession, Crawford. I'm not fully through it yet, but it is a really good book on the history of Ireland, the rise and fall of Christian Ireland. And I will say this about it, that it's really well researched, but it's very accessible to people, the average John like me. So Crawford, thank you so much for writing this book, and thank you so much for coming on today. But I'll just set that there, this wee advertisement for you. Tell us a wee bit about yourself, Crawford, just hobbies, interests, married life, family life. Tell us a wee bit about yourself there.
Yeah, sure, John. Thanks for the invitation to come and chat today. Looking forward to it. I grew up in Scotland. Mum and Dad are from more or less where we live here, which is just outside, sort of halfway between Ballymena and Antrim. I'm married to Pauline. She is from just outside Brisbane, and we've got 4 children, and they age from about 16 down to about 7. And I work in Belfast to teach history at Queen's. So that's kind of who I am and what I do.
Have you haven't always taught in Queen's? Where did you?
I worked in Dublin for a while at Trinity College. I was there at various stages, at various jobs there over the years, for probably about 11 years in Dublin, and I was in Manchester for 3 years in between some of those Dublin-based jobs. So we lived out in Laois, so a couple of our children were born in Laois, which probably gives them a very distinct approach to life, I'm not quite sure. And then one was born in Manchester, and then one was born up here in Antrim. So that's sort of our kind of family story. So
very good. And what kind of, because history is obviously very wide, where do you specialize? Obviously you specialize in Ireland, in Irish history and history of religion. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for drawing attention to that book, John. I don't really specialize in Irish history, but I just had this. The sort of background to that book was obviously Ireland, both sides of the border, has gone through, really enormous changes, social and religious changes in the last 30 years, let's say. And I wanted to understand that book's the sort of the outcome of that project. But I mean, mainly what I get paid to teach is 17th century, British and Irish history, 17th century. So all the kind of gory stuff about civil wars and massacres and revolutions and so forth. So all of that. And then I also teach a course called Apocalypse, the History and Anthropology of the End of the World. And I love that course because we basically look at all of these end of the world groups from about the 16th century through to the present day, which might be religious groups or political groups or UFO cults or, ISIS or, anything under the sun that has got a connection to the end of the world. So I mean, we did stuff in COP26, for example, all the apocalyptic rhetoric coming out of the climate conference that took place in Glasgow last year. And obviously, one of the other really interesting people who's much in the news at the moment, if you're interested in Ukraine-Russia conflict, is Alexander Dugin, who's a Russian Orthodox apocalyptic thinker, whose ideas of Russia and the world seem to be influencing or maybe influencing certain trends in Russian popular discourse about how to think about that kind of Eurasianist part of the world and Russia's responsibility in it. So that's all of that stuff is what we do. And
did I see you'd written a book on that, or a couple of books on that, have you?
That's
kind of
right,
apocalyptic stuff.
Exactly, yeah. So various bits and pieces on that. I mean, it's such a kind of curious subject, and it's constantly in the news. People are constantly interested in it. Yeah. And once you become sort of attuned to hearing end of the world kind of language, you actually hear it everywhere.
Yeah.
in discussions of the economy, in discussions of science, and discussions of politics. Do you know what I mean? It just keeps cropping up. So once you get the structures, once you get the vocabulary, then you begin to realize, actually, you know, we're hearing a lot of this, but actually we've been hearing a lot of this for a very long time.
Yeah.
And you know, it's maybe we're not quite as close to the end as we think. Maybe we're much closer than we think. But certainly we've always thought, you know, certainly in Western Europe and North America, we have a long history of speculating and worrying about all of this. And of course, a lot of that worry is driven by the sense of apocalyptic fear that doesn't recognize that actually, you know, the biblical story here is the story of redemption, of recreation, of renewal, of hope, and that's renewal and hope not just for individuals or for the church collectively, but for the planet and indeed the cosmos as a whole. So, you know, Christianity, people often think of it as quite a kind of a narrow, you know, narrowly focused ethical system, but actually it's a story, an epic story of how the world gets completely ruined, and then God in his mercy decides he's going to sort it out, and he's doing it, and he will continue to do it.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. And I saw you're interested not only in areas but people as well. So John Owen is especially, and very different, Jane Darby as well.
That's right. Yeah. So those are two figures. John Owen would have been a 17th century Puritan writer. He wrote a lot about politics. He wrote a lot about different theological issues. He wrote a commentary in the New Testament book called Hebrews, which is probably the longest commentary ever written on a New Testament book. It's like 2 million words long.
No way.
He was briefly in Ireland. He came as the chaplain to Oliver Cromwell. So, you know, there's an issue with that. But he was also a Republican theorist and one of England's earliest Republican theorists. And, you know, he has a legacy within that tradition. Jane Darby's completely different because he comes from an Irish family, an Anglo-Irish family. His family actually owned Leap Castle, or as it's known in Offaly, Leap Castle, which is the most haunted castle in Ireland.
There you go.
And there's all kinds of interesting stories, even of ghosts in Jane Darby's day. So he's a 19th century religious writer, a priest in the Church of Ireland, who grew really discouraged by the links between the Church of Ireland and the state, and wanted to call Christians back to what the New Testament said how Christians should be organized or not organized, how Christians should think about everything from politics through to theology, through to scripture. And, you know, he had a really, really revolutionary impact on Christianity in these islands and far beyond. And, he's probably most famous today for the way he thinks about the end of the world. But actually, that's a tiny, tiny, tiny part of what he was interested in. So there's something like, I don't know, there's probably about 40 or 45 volumes of his works, if you count all the things that get published. I think only 4 of those are dedicated to prophetic matters. A lot of it's to do with politics, a lot of it's to do with sometimes even philosophy. He writes a lot, obviously, about scripture. He writes a complete commentary in the Bible from beginning to end, his synopsis. And he makes a massive, massive impact. I think one of the reasons that I get excited by Jane Darby is because he's not bound up with 16th century divisions in the church, right? So whenever he comes to a question, his response is not, what do the Catholics think? What do the Protestants think? And he sort of projects himself right the way back to the New Testament, and actually has a really interesting and surprising way of thinking about what the boundaries of the church are and who true believers are within that and where they can be found. So I find Jane Darby a really, really, really interesting writer. So
I will go along with him and definitely that. Not thinking getting back to what the actual Bible says and away from what the church It's kind of has made of it, whether either side of it, that resonates with me. Like, so very good, very good. Well, and you're, am I right in saying that you're writing another book? Oh, you've done a lot of writing this last couple of years.
Yeah, well, I'm doing one on GN Darby, but I'm trying to do one on GN Darby at the minute. So that's the plan.
When are you reckoning that'll be out?
I don't know. I mean, in theory, it should be done by the end of this year.
Okay.
But it might not happen exactly that. But hopefully next year it should be out. Hopefully next year, all being well.
Very good, very good. Well, that gives us a wee bit of idea about who you are and what you're into, the kind of area. I want to talk a wee bit about history just before we get into St. Patrick, because this is what we're going to think about. If you could tell us, what is the kind of process of coming to know history, like the old adage that history is written by the victors and all that kind of stuff? How do you sort, as a historian, how do you go in and find the truth? Because there seems to be a big level of almost detective work, guess, or assumption at times. So how do you sift history?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question, John, isn't it, really? Because the answer to that question can either be incredibly simple or incredibly complicated. And I mean, in part, the answer to that question very much depends on which period you're interested in. So if you're interested in what happened in the 1990s, right, you've got a vast amount of material to read, to sift through. I mean, it would take you the rest of your life and far beyond. It would be impossible, actually, for someone to do a really detailed narrative. Even of something of the global financial crisis in 2008, let's say, or think of the incredible number of things that have happened since 2016, Trump, Brexit, COVID, Ukraine. It's been a really extraordinary 5 years. Yeah. So for someone to start sifting through all that material and making sense of it would be a massive undertaking. Whereas, if you go right the way back to, I don't know, the sort of early medieval period in Ireland, well, there's not virtually nothing written down.
What era are you talking about there when you say medieval?
So maybe 5th century, so 300s, 400s, 500s, those years. There's hardly any written materials. So basically what you're doing is you're standing around holes in the ground, looking at things that archaeologists have dug up and thinking, well, why is that slab over there, or why is this person buried in this way, and then sort of trying to extrapolate from that what you can figure out about the culture that created that particular hole in the ground. You know what I mean? So sometimes people who work on older history, the further back you go, sometimes it's easier to have a more general understanding of what's going on, because in a way there's fewer facts to know. In the more modern period, the more modern you come, the more facts there are available to you. And so, the question of how do you know the truth, that's a really difficult question, because sometimes people say creative writers, novelists, and so on, screenwriters, creative writers make things up, but historians leave things out. Okay. And, I think that's true, because, there's historians are always trying to tell a story as well. They're trying to give a shape to the information they've gathered. They might not have very much, or they might have a huge amount, but they still have to impose a shape on it, an explanation. And sometimes they've got the luxury of being able to triangulate a fact, so they can get the same fact from 3 or 4 different sources, and then they can have some confidence in that. Okay. The further back you go, often you don't have that luxury, so you've only got sort of isolated documents or isolated archaeological bits and pieces, and you've got to be quite creative in how you put the data together to make it make sense. So it's tricky, I think it's a tricky thing.
Have you been involved in those kind of archaeological digs and sites?
No, I mean, I've taken my eldest son back when we lived in Laois. We would have gone to digs that UCD put on for children, and UCD in Dublin would have run archaeological events and invited children just to come and see what we're doing. And at that point, I think we were going through an Indiana Jones phase in the house. So there was a certain kind of excitement about, would there be a skeleton? or something like that. And of course, there wasn't ever very many skeletons at UCD.
Mm-hmm.
No skeletons at UCD.
Very good. Very good. Well, tell us a wee bit, just as we come to St. Patrick now, tell us a wee bit about the background of of probably Europe and Britain, as it was known then, just to kind of set us up for St. Patrick.
All right. Well, I mean, I suppose that the big thing to understand about Europe in this period, which is the very early 400s, let's say, is that the Roman Empire has expanded and expanded. And as it has expanded, it has pushed certain people groups, including people that we would know as the Celts, further and further west. And so, the Celtic population begins probably somewhere in Turkey, Greece, that kind of region. But as Rome grows in power and influence, that population group seems to get pushed ever further west across Europe. And by the time we're talking about, by the sort of late 300s, early 400s, that population group is populating places like northern France, the southwest of England, Wales, Ireland, and parts of Scotland as well. Not all of Scotland, but parts of Scotland. And they're always sort of on the edge of the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire, controls the Mediterranean basin. It controls much of England and Wales. Mm-hmm. It has got bases, military bases, trading bases in southern parts of Scotland, and it's got trading links with Ireland, but it never really has a military impact in Ireland. So Ireland is still outside the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire is a European civilization. It's Latin speaking generally. There's a lot of regional variety, but the experience of being a young man in the Roman Empire is broadly similar no matter where you are. Similar kinds of education, similar kinds of religion by this stage, that Christianity has become an official religion of the empire. And that's pretty much where things stand. So we don't know exactly when Patrick gets born, but it seems to be towards the end of the Roman Empire, the Roman Empire's power and influence in these islands. So about 407, I think it is, there's been a lot of unrest in the empire, and Roman troops begin to withdraw. And eventually they withdraw entirely from the island of Britain, as they call it, what we would recognise as Scotland, England, Wales. And as the Roman troops withdraw, it creates a kind of a power vacuum, which pirates, for want of a better word, from Ireland take advantage of. And, all of a sudden, here are these sort of Roman towns that are now incredibly isolated and don't really have any credible defence. And they become, fairly easy prey. And so these isolated Latin-speaking cities or towns, really, in places like Dumbarton, just outside modern-day Glasgow, they become, very attractive places for these pirates to come and raid. And it seems to be the case that Patrick grows up in one of these sort of isolated Latin-speaking outposts of what was once the Roman Empire's territory in these islands. But the Roman power has collapsed, and Patrick seems to come from a fairly wealthy background. He comes from a family that owns slaves. He also comes from a Christian background. His father was a priest, and his grandfather was a priest, and his father was a deacon.
Okay.
So he grows up in this kind of Christian atmosphere, but he himself is not a Christian, as he says himself. And anyway, just after his 16th birthday, around his 16th birthday, pirate ship comes, takes Patrick, kidnaps a lot of Patrick's slaves, and takes him back to Ireland. And Patrick finds himself, his whole world is turned upside down, because now he's living as a slave in a culture that's completely different from the Roman culture he's grown up in. Probably no one is speaking Latin. Probably his masters or his owners are speaking to him in some kind of version, an older version of modern Irish. And that I think then seems to set him really questioning, what's happened, what's been the value of the Christian faith I was raised in but never myself embraced, and is there a God?
So Ireland would have been very different to the Roman Empire. Never touched really Ireland. It was perceived as very violent. Is that right? and it's very different from Britain.
It was different. It was certainly different when Patrick would have been grown up. Definitely, I think. I mean, while Roman Britain was more or less Christianized, not totally, but more or less Christianized, Ireland had never been Christianized. Now, there were a small pocket of Christians, a small gathering of Christians in Ireland in the year 431. That's the earliest evidence we have for Christians being on this island.
Where were they? Do you know?
We don't know. All we know is that the Pope sent Palladius, who was a bishop from the French church, to come and look after them, and he sent as the first bishop of the Christians in Ireland. But who these Christians were, we don't know. Patrick seems to come after this point in his missionary career. So it may be the case, because the dates are really unknown, but it may be the case that when Patrick was a slave, he was a slave before the arrival of Palladius. That would in some sense make sense of different parts of the story. So, you know, he's any Christians in Ireland, but somehow it's his experience of being a slave in Ireland that, or as he tells us, because he writes a lot about his own life, really interesting. But it's that experience that makes him begin to pray. And, you know, he becomes very, very sincere in his prayers and prays up to 100 times a day. But he's living out, you know, he's living out in the wild. He's looking after sheep, I think it is. And, you know, rain, hail, or shine, you know, he's praying constantly. He's on his own. And that's the kind of life he leads.
Slavery, because he's taken at 16 from somewhere in Britain, he's taken over to Ireland. Slavery would have been pretty horrendous in terms of how they would have dealt with him.
Yeah, I mean, we don't really know too much about it, but slavery, you know, slavery by its nature is not a happy experience, is it? And you know, we can work out something of what the culture was like that he was a slave in. And as you said before, John, you know, it's probably a fairly violent culture. If anyone goes down to the National Museum down in Dublin, you'll see there an exhibition of bog bodies, and these are sort of leathery bodies that get pulled out of bogs every few years. The last one actually was found in Laois about 2012, I think it was. So the farmers, when they're cutting moss, cutting peat, often, well, not often, but fairly regularly come across these bodies or other things that were deposited in bogs in that period. And, you know, archaeologists, scientists can date these bodies, and they've dated the deposition of these bodies is happening over a couple of thousand years, really, in this period. So it seems to be that there's this custom, this habit in pre-Christian Ireland of communities sacrificing an elite male, a young elite male, a prince or something like that, as a way of ensuring the favour of whatever deities were in their cosmology that would ensure good harvests or plenty in the growing season. So that seems to be the culture. Now, in terms of the economic power of this culture, it seems to be quite impressive, because some of those bog bodies have been recovered with items or even cosmetics on them that have been brought from Spain and places like that. I mean, we know that near Larne, County Antrim, there was an axe in an earlier period. There was an axe factory, and archaeologists found something like 15,000 axe heads on a beach in Larne. But they also found that the very particular kind of stone that these axe heads were made out of, that they could trace the circulation of these axes because they were so peculiar to County Antrim, and they found these axes all over these islands and far beyond. So, you know, we mustn't get the idea that Ireland's out here in the sort of west of Europe, in the middle of the Atlantic, and it's completely disconnected. It's not part of the Roman Empire, but it is part of all of these really interesting trading networks with what we might call Celtic cultures elsewhere. But also there's been discoveries of Roman gold dug up around Coleraine and places like that. You know, and either this is evidence that there were very strong trading links and Romans were landing and maybe buying slaves here, because they certainly did at a later stage, or whether you know, these buried depositions of Roman coins were the fruits of pirate raids that might have taken place.
Hmm.
Again, it goes back to your earlier question.
Yeah.
What's the data of history? It's just sometimes it's just an object, and you've got to try and figure out what the background to the object is.
Yeah, no, that's good. So Ireland would have been very different, very religiously different than what you're saying. They're sacrificed. They're very pagan, polytheistic. I'm not even sure which name to put on that. But so for Patrick coming into that, and for Patrick to have a conversion to Christianity, do we know what that looks like, or what he believed in that, or what were his core beliefs in Christianity? Or
yeah, his core beliefs are reasonably easy to establish because he writes about them at length. With Patrick, there's a lot that we don't know about Patrick, right? So we don't know the dates, all the kind of stuff that modern historians like to know. When was he born? When did he die? All the kind of the dates. He's not interested in that. That's not what he's interested in. What he wants to tell you is the meaning of his life. And the meaning of his life is, I was lost, now I'm found. Christ has saved me, I'm now his servant. That's basically what he wants us to take away from his life. So we don't know when he was born. We don't know when he came to Ireland. He does tell us he was 16, but we don't know what year that was. But we can get a sense of the shape of his conversion, but it seems to be quite a kind of gradual type of conversion. I think sometimes people talk about religious conversion as if it always has to be sudden and dramatic. But even in the New Testament, if you go to the founding of the church in Ephesus in the New Testament, there's the example there, or Philippi, I should say. There's the example there of the jailer in Philippi, and his conversion is incredibly dramatic. It happens after an earthquake, and he's about to commit suicide, and it's very dramatic. But there's in the same city, there's also a lady who gets converted, and it just says in Acts, the Lord opened her heart to believe what Paul said, and it seems to be very quiet, very gradual, not very dramatic. So, Patrick's conversion seems to be not especially dramatic. He's been educated in Christianity. He knows what the story of Christianity is, but he just doesn't believe it. But when he gets to Ireland, working as a slave, out there on his own, he just begins to pray. And as he prays, somehow all of this fits together. I mean, there's a really good website called confessio.ie, like confession, but without the N at the end. So confessio.ie. And confessio.ie has got the text of Patrick's confession.
Okay.
And you can read it, his own words, his own life story. But in terms of, so he tells us a little bit of his conversion, but he really tells us much more about what he believes. And, it's a very straightforward account of what Christianity means for an individual. So, he describes himself as being a stone stuck in mud. And, that's before he becomes a Christian, he's a stone that's stuck in mud. And as you read Patrick, one of the things about Patrick is his mind is saturated in the Bible. So anytime he's describing his own experience, he's often thinking of a particular Bible passage to understand his own experience. So in that case, he's thinking of one of the Psalms, Psalm 40, that describe the Lord lifting someone up and giving them life. And he goes on to talk about the importance of baptism. He goes on to talk about rejecting pagan gods. He goes on. One of the things that Patrick is really interested in is the coming again of Jesus Christ. So he writes about that a lot. He seems to believe that Ireland is like the last place to be evangelized in the known world. And he thinks of that passage in Matthew 24 where Jesus says, the gospel will go through all the world and then the end will come. And he sort of sees his own role then as preparing the way for the second coming. And he lives in the expectation, the confidence that Christ will come again. So, he's not engaging with some of the later theological debates, but there's a real kind of New Testamentness, if that's a word, to the way that he thinks about what being a Christian is. And in one of the New Testament books, Paul describes the church in Thessalonica as turning from idols to the living God and to wait for his son from heaven. That's almost more or less a direct quote. And that seems to be exactly what Patrick is talking about. They're turning away from idols. They're turning to the living God, who is Trinity, and he's a very strong Trinitarian focus. And part of that Trinitarian focus is waiting for God's Son to come back from heaven.
And it's probably ironic that Patrick is the I suppose the Bishop of Ireland, or St. Patrick of Ireland, because probably a lot of Ireland struggle with that dichotomy of believing in a God and believing maybe something of the Christian faith, but it's almost like that belief that Patrick had when he was 16 back in Britain, that it was very vague, very, maybe he, believed in it or not, maybe, but something happens in him that it becomes real, and God becomes something living and breathing in his life, and that totally changes and totally reshapes him. And probably I think that's the dichotomy for a lot of people, or the problem for a lot of people, is that they believe in some sense, but they have never made the Lord real in their life, or allowed him to come in and be real in their life. I think that's a huge lesson, even for us here. So Patrick come in, had his conversion, probably steadily over time, as you were saying, began to come to know the Lord. At that time, he's enslaved in Ireland, and there's debate of where that is that right?
Yeah, I mean, either it's in Mayo or Antrim, but I'm going to persuade people that it's in Antrim, because then we'll get the trade,
Okay.
And I mean, all the stories about Slemish can't be wrong, can they? But wherever it was, Patrick's missionary career was beyond the boundaries of Irish Christianity. So I mentioned before Palladius, and Palladius is the first bishop of the Christians in Ireland, but he seems to exercise his ministry around Leinster. But if you look at place names, and again, this goes back to your first question, John, what's the data of history? For a lot of the story of Patrick, it's place names. So places that got a traditional association with Patrick tend to be on the western or in the northern parts of the country. Does that make sense?
Okay.
So that seems to give us a clue then that Patrick seems to be associated historically with places as far away from sort of the modern Dublin area as they possibly could be.
Okay.
And he writes in his confession, is the confessio.ie website. He writes in his confession about going into the wildest parts of Ireland where paganism is still strong, but seeing many thousands of people baptized. That's the number he tells us. Thousands of people baptized, and many of the sons and daughters of the most elite families entering the Christian life as monks or nuns or as priests. So he's really keen on pushing out, and we don't need to take all the traditional stories about combating druids and chasing out snakes and so on at face value. There's probably not there might not be a whole lot of evidence for the druid stuff. There's no evidence that he chased out snakes, because there was no snakes here to begin with.
Is it right that's probably a metaphor for defeating the devil?
Is it? Yeah, maybe, or I don't know. I have no idea. It could be. I mean, it could be, or it could just be a way of explaining why there's no snakes in Ireland. Or at least there weren't until exotic pet shops started coming and selling, all the stuff that they sell. So so that's what he seems to be doing, and it seems to obviously a Bible man. As I said to you before, his writing is really saturated by the Bible, and he's constantly quoting the Bible. And if you go onto the confessio.ie website, you'll see just reference after reference after reference, and the references that website's picked up are not exhaustive. There's many more. So at some point we have to imagine Patrick going about with a Bible, with a book, in a culture in which there are no books. So because early medieval Irish had never been written down, there were no books in that language. But Patrick is carrying, you can imagine, Patrick carrying about a book. And, what is that object? What does that object mean? So we can thank Patrick, among many other things, for bringing books to Ireland, probably for the very first time too.
That's quite a legacy. So obviously Ireland was massively affected, and as you said, many thousands turned to the Lord. So you have Palladius coming in first, and he had a group with him, and then Patrick coming in after that, and Patrick sees this, well, we would call it this revival that happens. Did Patrick have there was obviously difficulty and persecution against Patrick, but did he have a strategy in how he, obviously a man of the book and preached the word, but did he have a strategy in how he went about it or anything like that?
It's a good question, John. I don't really know. I'm not sure he talks a lot about it. He certainly has followers, and his followers go with him. But I mean, he experiences a great deal of opposition. He is enslaved several times, even as a bishop operating in Ireland. It's possible, and this is interesting, it's possible also that he faces opposition within the church. Because it seems to be the case that when Patrick is a slave, right, gets converted, probably his early 20s, has a strange dream in which God tells him to try to escape. He does escape, but it takes him about 7 years to make his way from Ireland back to his home, right? And then, so he's arriving back home, probably in his early 20s or mid 20s, maybe even late 20s. His family are obviously delighted to see him. But he's got a lot of catching up to do because he's a young Roman man who's never finished his education.
Okay.
So somehow he's got to try and figure out what his career is going to be. Don't quite know how that happens. But in his mid-40s, he gets this call to go back to Ireland. And again, it comes in a dream. And his family don't want him to leave. His family promise him all kinds of rewards and presents. But he says, that I've been called. God has called me to go back to Ireland. So he goes back to Ireland, and it's possible that seems to be the very first time an actual missionary, has gone beyond the boundary of the Roman Empire to spread the Christian message. So Patrick might be the first person ever, as far as we know, he might be the first person ever to cross beyond Roman civilization with the message about Jesus Christ. So that's an extraordinary thing. But he also goes as someone who hates slavery because he's been a slave. So the funny thing is, Patrick not only becomes one of the first Christian missionaries to cross beyond the Roman Empire, he also becomes one of the earliest activists against slavery. And he writes a letter to one of these Irish pirates I mentioned before, who was actually enslaving Irish Christian converts. So, Patrick writes this letter. He describes in the letter how some of these converts had been gathered together for a baptism service, and no sooner were they baptized than the pirates came and kidnapped them and sold them out of Ireland to pagans in Scotland and places elsewhere. And Patrick is just appalled by this. So, we have to think of him as a kind of an anti-slavery campaigner as well. Probably one of the first, but he's an anti-slavery campaigner on the basis that he himself had been a slave and knew exactly what that life was like.
That's interesting. It's interesting how something so traumatic that happened to a person that it's just used to turn him around and to actually be a blessing to so many in Ireland. That's interesting. So he did have Ireland was revolutionized as a result of Patrick coming and the message that he preached. As we kind of come to the end of Patrick's life, what is his legacy to not only subsequent generations in Ireland, but even to us today?
That's a great question, John. So there's two Patricks, right? There's the Patrick of history, the Patrick who speaks for himself, and then there's the Patrick of mythology.
Okay.
And that's the Patrick that other people are often describing. So if you go to that website, confessio.ie, you'll hear Patrick speak in his own words. And the Patrick that we see there has got a very straightforward Christian faith. He talks a lot about preaching. He talks a lot about telling people about the reality of sin and the possibility of forgiveness through faith in Jesus Christ. He talks a lot about the importance of baptism and the Eucharist and church life. He talks a lot about the coming again of Jesus Christ. He talks a lot about fellowship with God as Trinity, all of those things. The Patrick of myth is a Patrick that begins, it is based on the Patrick of history, but a lot of other stories begin to get associated with him, including the famous Shamrock explanation of the Trinity, which is technically heretical, but that's beside the point. And there's other stuff as well. So I suppose it depends which Patrick you're talking about, but the Patrick of history maybe has much more to offer us than the Patrick of mythology, because the Patrick of history is someone who would always point us back to the Bible, not to himself. And, you know, Patrick in Christian history has become an incredibly important person in this country. You know, where, you know, churches named after him, schools are named after him, people are named after him. You know, he's a really, really important person. But actually, the Patrick of history, I think, would have been a bit uncomfortable with that. Because for him, it wasn't all about Patrick. It was actually all about Jesus Christ. And he was much more interested. You know, whenever he sat down to write his own story, he could have just written his own story. I was born in April 405. You know, I went to school here. This is the name of my teacher, mum and dad, so on and so forth. But he doesn't. He's always thinking, what does the Bible say about me? Oh, I know. I was a sinner. So what's the Bible image for that? I was a stone stuck in mud. That's what I was like. Then I want to say that Jesus rescued me. How can I say that? What Bible passage can I use? You know, and that's the way he seems to think. So he's constantly filtering his thinking about himself through, you know, what he's read in the Bible. And that, I mean, I think that's a very, very powerful message, because he's not even using his own words a lot of the time. Does that make sense? He's quoting and quoting and quoting. So why does he keep quoting the Bible? Why is he allowing the Bible to tell him who he was and who he is now and what he will be one day? And that's because, you know, the Patrick of history really lived under the Bible. The Bible told him everything he needed to know about himself, about sin, about salvation through faith in Jesus Christ, about reconciliation with God, about being part of God's family, the church, about baptism, Lord's Supper, you know, you name it, the Bible told him everything. So I think, I mean, in terms of legacy, Patrick's legacy would probably be the same legacy as any other Christian that's worth paying attention to. The Christians that are worth paying attention to are the Christians who tell you that they are not worth paying attention to. You know, the Christians who point away from themselves to the Bible, to Jesus Christ, to the work of the Holy Spirit, to reconciliation with the Father, to the importance of life in the church, the importance of baptism, Lord's Supper, and so on. You know, that's Patrick's legacy. And that's a legacy for all Christians. You know, that's not a legacy for this group or that denomination or this one. That's a legacy for everybody, because the Bible belongs to everybody.
Yeah. And it's just even interesting, like we're chatting about Darby earlier on, and that's what he did as well, like back to the Bible. And that's like that that resonates with me so much. People constantly ask me, like, what am I? Like, am I Catholic? Am I Protestant? I'm neither. You know, what I am predates all of that kind of stuff, because you get back to the Bible and get back to Jesus and get back to what is actually written. Yeah. I mean, in some ways, that question is 1,500 years too late.
That's right. Isn't it? You know.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that even for someone listening to this podcast, I think that would be a takeaway. Like, that would be a class takeaway for someone to say, right, well, I'm going to read this Bible that Patrick built his life upon. I'm going to read this Bible that so many people, that their lives have changed and turned around and totally redeemed. I think that's just a class analogy of that stone in the mud, completely stuck, completely, can't move, can't get on with life, completely stuck and going down. And to see a God that comes down and is able to rescue out of the mud, and to make us stand upon a rock. I think that's just a class analogy to even keep in our minds, even as we leave this podcast today. Yeah. So that's a class legacy. So thank you so much for that. Is there anything you want to add, Crawford, just as we finish up, to Patrick, or anything you feel we should be said?
No, John, that's great. I was just thinking, actually, as you were finishing there, about the U2 song Psalm 40 that they used to sing at the end of every concert. Which is a version of that psalm. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. He lifted me up out of the ditch, out of the miry clay. So maybe some people will remember that song. But that's a song that Patrick is thinking of as well. When he describes the experiences of being rescued by Jesus Christ.
Brilliant. Awesome. But listen, thank you so much, Crawford. We really just appreciate you coming on and spending time and talking through Patrick and talking through history. It's been very helpful to understand his life and just how applicable that is to even our life as well, and his legacy. So thank you so much. Really do appreciate that.
Thanks, John. Thanks very much.
And thank you so much for listening as well. These podcasts are going to be ongoing, so do look out for them on social media. And we do try to answer the big questions of the universe and of our hearts. And if anything has stuck with you, or if you do have a question, do feel free to contact us. You're really welcome to send in questions, or if you do have even ideas for podcasts that we do or could do, please do contact us. But we do thank you for joining us today. Slán go fóill.